This is a video about monitoring. And basically, there are two ways to monitor. You can monitor with speakers or headphones, and there are advantages and disadvantages of each. Here's a video that talks about that. Most audio engineers will at times monitor using speakers and other times will use headphones. The primary advantage of using headphones is that if the listener is used to the sound of a particular set of headphones, then when working in different studios or different locations, the listener will have a good reference when using those headphones. Typically, the size of the room affects signals below 300 Hz, but this isn't a factor with phones. Other advantages are that headphones dynamically compress the sound so that subtle details can be heard that might have gone unnoticed on speakers. Also, many listeners use headphones or earbuds on their iPods or other MP3 players, so mixing using phones will better replicate what the sound will be like for them. The disadvantages of headphones include the perception that the stereo field is much wider than it actually is when played on speakers. Also, the subtle details that can be heard on headphones are often lost on speakers. Because of this, some sounds may not be loud enough in the mix. However, the biggest disadvantage is that prolonged use of headphones, especially at high volume, can permanently damage hearing. So headphones sound the same in every room. Very subtle details can be heard very clearly. I know when I'm mastering a song, I'll listen for the fade out at the end because I can hear that much better with headphones than I can on speakers. And any little noise is more obvious on headphones as well. The room doesn't affect the playback. It doesn't matter where you are. If you have your headphones, it's going to sound pretty much the same. And headphones and earbuds are the way that many people ultimately will listen, so it needs to sound good on headphones. So the disadvantages are that headphones can compress the sound so that lower level material may be mixed too low. You can hear it fine on the headphones, but when you play it on speakers, it just gets lost. Since all sound is direct with headphones, the mix will sound much wider stereo-wise than on speakers. And again, that's because you only hear the left in the left ear and the right in the right ear, but on speakers, depending on where you're standing, you may hear it somewhere in the middle. Since all sound is direct, more reverb than necessary may be added to the mix. I'm not sure I agree with this one. I actually hear the reverb better on headphones than I do on speakers, but the ratio of reverb to dry signal is different on headphones than on speakers. And then finally, prolonged use of headphones may cause hearing loss. It really depends how loud you listen. If you listen loudly on speakers, that's going to be a problem too. In fact, ironically, earbuds may be better for stage monitoring than having wedges and just having a loud backline because you can control the mix that you want with your in-ear monitor and you may be rejecting a lot of the other sound that's coming from the backline, like you might be standing next to the drummer and hearing the cymbals in your left ear or right ear. In fact, now that in concerts everything is mic'd pretty much, guitars often will use direct boxes from their pedal boards. Some bands have fake amps on stage. This is a chart that maps out the frequency response of several instruments and talks about how below 300 Hz, the room really is the biggest factor. And we talked about that earlier too, that if a room isn't at least 20 feet in one dimension, you can't hear below about 60 Hz. And so, again, depending on the room you're in, that can be an issue with speakers, but not with headphones. I should also mention, just as speakers can sound different, headphones can as well. I have several different pairs of headphones, and they all sound slightly different. And the way to get around that is to do an A/B check. And here's a short video about that. Speakers and headphones all have slightly varied characteristics that can affect the sound reproduction. That is, some boost or attenuate certain frequencies more than others. And the type of dampening that some speakers exhibit can affect the amplitude envelope. Below 300 Hz, the room itself primarily affects the frequency response. So, when evaluating an audio signal in different locations or on different speakers or headphones, it's helpful to have a reference. This reference can be a well-recorded CD, LP, cassette, or digital file that's similar in style or genre to the material that you're recording or mixing. It's a plus if the reference material you're using has won a Grammy or has been a commercial success. The comparison of the sound characteristics, the volume, timbre, and spatial effects of the reference file to the audio that's being recorded or mixed produces a reality check. For example, it becomes obvious if there's too much of a particular instrument, if the voice-to-music mix is correct, if there's too much reverb or delay, etc. However, be aware that the reference file being used has very likely been mastered and has some additional compression. Mastering engineers prefer to have a bit more dynamic range in the files they receive. One solution would be to add more compression in the monitor chain as opposed to the program chain, or simply remove the program limiting during the final bounce. That way, the new material can be monitored with compression even though it isn't actually being compressed, so that it sounds more like the reference. So if you get used to any particular monitoring arrangement, whether it's speakers or headphones, it doesn't matter. They don't have to be $100,000 speakers. They can be anything you want. But as long as you listen to a lot of material on that system, you'll be able to evaluate what you're recording and mixing in the proper context. Another issue, and this affects both headphones and speakers, is dampening. When a spring is stretched and released, it may go through one or more cycles of compression and expansion before settling back to its original position. When a string on a musical instrument is struck, plucked, picked, or bowed, it also goes through cycles of vibration. The string will vibrate less if it's dampened and will produce a shorter sustain and release portion of the amplitude envelope. Dampening can also be a factor in speakers. When a speaker is excited by a signal, it can react in 4 ways. 1. The speaker can be overdamped, meaning that it'll return to its equilibrium position without any dampening cycles. 2. The speaker can be critically damped, meaning that it will very quickly return to the equilibrium position with very few oscillations. 3. The speaker could be underdamped, meaning that it will oscillate for a while before returning to the equilibrium position. Or 4. The speaker could be undamped and actually oscillate at its resonance frequency. Most high-quality studio audio speakers are closer to being critically damped, while many cheaper consumer speakers tend to be closer to underdamped. This means that especially bass notes will sound more staccato, have a shorter amplitude envelope when heard on studio speakers, and more legato, have a longer amplitude envelope when heard on some consumer gear. A friend of mine who was a mastering engineer told me that he had some really expensive speakers, and when the bands would come in to get their songs mastered, they would notice the bass sounded different, and that's because his speakers were more critically damped than underdamped, so the bass sounded much more staccato. This is about audio distortion. When audio is altered from its original waveform, it's being distorted. So technically, when audio engineers or musicians add signal processing like EQ, dynamic compression, or other effects, those actions create distortion to the original signal. But they're done to modify the timbre and they're intentional. However, there are some types of distortion that are unintentional. The first is clipping or amplitude distortion. This is when the audio exceeds the headroom of a particular amplifier or processor. The second is harmonic distortion. Here, overtones, generally in whole number multiples of the fundamental, are added to the original signal. Usually, harmonic distortion up to 3% is considered tolerable. The third is frequency response distortion. This happens when the room acoustics or the speakers, amplifiers, or headphones enhance certain frequencies and minimize others. The fourth is phase distortion. This occurs when there are timing differences between certain portions of the audio signal, which cause phase cancellations. These unintentional types of distortions degrade the quality of the audio signal, and care should be taken to avoid them. So in addition to what I mentioned in that video, there is also intermodulation distortions. That's when some indifference tones can be created when 2 frequencies are very close but not exactly on pitch. You can have harmonic distortion, and up to about 3% total harmonic distortion is considered acceptable, but beyond 3% we start to notice it and it becomes annoying. Transient distortion, that's when the speakers can't keep up with the rapidly changing signal. And we've talked about transients with microphones, the subtle changes that happen in the audio. And then there's loudness distortion. Of course, that's the most obvious one, where you're actually clipping or overloading the components, generally the preamp, but you actually get a distorted signal that way. And of course, if you're a guitar player, you love it, but for just about everything else, it doesn't sound that great. In fact, if you look at a sine wave on an oscilloscope that's distorted, it appears to be a square wave. The top just gets clipped off and it looks square. Another thing that you may not have thought about is the location of the speaker in the room. Whether the speaker is not against a wall, in that case, the speaker radiates basically in a sphere. If the speaker is against the wall, then it radiates in a hemisphere. If it's in a corner of the wall, it radiates in a quarter of a sphere. And if it's up near the ceiling where 3 corners come together, it only radiates in an eighth of a sphere. And that can change the bass response. And a lot of powered speakers have controls where you can actually make up for these room variances. The ultimate listening position for stereo is an equilateral triangle where the speakers are at 2 of the vertices and you're at the third. So it's 60 degrees all the way around and equidistant between everything. Of course, that's ideal, and generally it doesn't happen exactly that way, but often you can still hear pretty good stereo even if you don't exactly have an equilateral triangle. However, when we monitor stereo, we don't just hear signals coming from the left and the right, we hear them coming from all across the front. And that's because of the phantom center. And here's a short video about that. Mixing in stereo as opposed to mono makes it easier to hear the individual sounds in the mix. It also adds a spatial dimension to the recording. When listening to a stereo mix, the sound is typically reproduced on two speakers, left and right, or on headphones or earbuds. However, the listener can generally perceive sound coming from locations other than simply left or right. In fact, most of the sounds may appear to come from points located in between the left and right speakers. Stereo images can be created naturally by recording with stereo microphones, or done by using pan pots to direct the sound to positions within the stereo field. When an audio signal is routed equally to the left and right, the perception to the listener is that the sound is actually coming from a speaker in the center, even though no center speaker exists. This non-existent center channel speaker is called the phantom center. So here's the scheme for a 5.1 surround sound system. You have the equilateral triangle with the left and the right. They add a center channel speaker, and that's for dialogue, and that's so that you perceive the dialogue is coming from the screen as opposed to the left or the right. The surround speakers are somewhere between 100 and 120 degrees from the center, and then the subwoof doesn't really matter. You can put that pretty much anywhere in the room. The first film with the current Dolby Digital 5.1 surround soundtrack was Batman Returns in 1992. The 5.1 arrangement has 3 channels across the front of the screen, left, center, right, 2 surround channels, left and right, and 1 channel for low-frequency effects, abbreviated LFE, for the rumbles, gunshots, and explosions. This LFE channel is the 0.1 in the 5.1, since it deals only with audio in the lowest octave, as opposed to all 10 octaves like the other channels. In 1977, the original Dolby Surround, now typically called Dolby Pro Logic, was introduced with Star Wars Episode IV. Unlike Dolby Digital and other digital audio formats, it's a stereo-compatible analog format that can be decoded into 4 channels, left, center, right, and a mono surround. Way back in 1952, 25 years before Star Wars Episode IV, the film This Is Cinerama had a 7-channel surround soundtrack. However, 12 years earlier, in 1940, the Disney film Fantasia, when it was originally released in Fanasound, had a 3-channel playback and automated level controls and panning, with left and right speakers in the rear corners of the theater, making it the first ever film with surround sound. And this is the standard 5.1 theater calibration. They do the front speakers at 85 dB, and the president of Dolby Labs one time told me that the reason they picked 85 dB is because when the dialogue gets much louder than that, it tends to sound sibilant on just about any speaker. So 85 is a nice level. The surrounds are 3 dB less. Left and right, they're only 82 dB. And they set the gain on the subwoofer, the LFE, 10 dB higher than the main speakers at 95. And that's so that they don't have to have as much energy on the stem to get the big explosion. They actually have the speaker just turned up. In addition to 5.1, there are several other surround sound formats. Here's a video about that. As early as 1952, the film This Is Cinerama had a 7-channel surround soundtrack. In the early 70s, Quad Sound, a 4.0 format, was available for a very short period. In 1977, Star Wars Episode IV was the first film to have a Dolby Pro Logic soundtrack, with left, center, right, and surround. It was basically a 3.9, since the surround channel topped off at 7 kHz. In 1992, Batman Returns had the first Dolby Digital 5.1 soundtrack with left, center, right surround, and low-frequency effects. George Lucas developed a 6.1 system that added a center rear to the standard 5.1, so that starships flying from rear to front could be centered in the theater. This format is also known as EX or DTS-ES. Omnimax and IMAX films use a 6.0 speaker system that adds a high center speaker called top of screen to the standard 5.1 and eliminates the dedicated low-frequency effects track. Bass management redirects low-frequency sounds from all 6 channels to the subwoofer. For SDDS, Sony Dynamic Digital Sound, 2 additional front speakers, a left center and right center, are added to the standard 5.1 to produce 7.1 surround. There's also a variation of 7.1 where the 2 added speakers are placed on the sides as opposed to the front. This is known as 3/4.1. THX creator Tomlinson Holman introduced 10.2 surround that includes a rear center from 6.1, 2 additional side speakers from the 3/4.1, a left and right top of screen speaker similar to the IMAX scheme, and also adds a second subwoofer. This is a screen grab from a Red Green show where he makes a no-cost surround sound system with duct tape. It's a parody. He puts the speaker on a rotating ceiling fan so the speaker kind of goes around. And if you really want localization, there's the Dolby Atmos system. Here's the story about that. For cinema sound, most theaters today use either Dolby 5.1 or Sony Dynamic Digital Sound SDDS 7.1. IMAX and OmniMax theaters use either a 6.0 or 12.0 surround system. All of these provide the moviegoer a realistic surround sound experience. However, for an even better surround sound experience in theaters and other venues, Dolby introduced their Atmos system in 2012. It was first used in the Dolby Theater in Hollywood for the premiere of Brave. A year later, the Atmos system had been installed in around 300 theaters worldwide. As opposed to the standard left, center, right surround, and LFE in Dolby Digital 5.1, the Dolby Atmos system can support up to 64 different speakers. In addition to the standard speaker locations behind the screen and along the sides of the theater, the speakers can be mounted in an overhead array so that certain audio elements can be localized throughout the theater, making both the position and the movement of sounds very accurate. One issue that the mastering people have when they're doing the mix for the DVDs and the Blu-rays is just how much center channel to use. In the theaters, of course, you want all the dialogue to come from the center channel because you want the sound to come from behind the screen. But for home systems, it's a different story. Many people don't really have a good location for the center channel because that's where their flat screen TV is now. There's no place to really put a speaker. So a lot of times they'll kind of cheat on the dialogue and they'll put it maybe 50% in the center channel and 50% on the left and right to give it kind of a half phantom, half real center channel. Here's the story about IMAX and OmniMax sound. This has changed quite a bit. They used to run the sound from 3 synchronized CDs. One would be the left-right, one would be the center top of screen, and one would be the left-right surrounds. That's changed now because they don't do film either. Like most theaters, they're doing digital projection instead. And also now, many of the IMAX and OmniMax films have gone to a 12.0 sound system, which kind of mimics the Dolby Atmos. As opposed to a typical movie theater with a 6-channel 5.1 or an 8-channel 7.1 surround system, an IMAX or OmniMax surround system is configured slightly differently. Like a standard 5.1 arrangement, these large screen systems have a left, center, right, left surround, and right surround. But instead of a dedicated LFE channel, the low-frequency effects are handled through bass management, meaning that sounds below a certain frequency are redirected to the subwoofer. The 6th channel is called top of screen. It's a high center channel not too dissimilar from the center surround speaker in a 6.1 arrangement, so that sounds like rocket takeoffs can be panned to this speaker as the rocket climbs into the sky. Playback in IMAX or OmniMax theaters is done using 3 CDs with 2 tracks each, interlocked to the film, making it a double system playback not unlike the early Vitaphone system. There's also an analog backup using an interlocked 6-track 35mm film in case there's a problem with the CDs. And some newer IMAX and OmniMax theaters have a 12-channel surround system with additional overhead speakers. Another issue with speakers is how you're listening to them. Is it near field or far field? When we built the studio in 1986, we had far field speakers, which we used pretty much for about 10 years. But then we kind of changed. Sometime in the 90s, we switched over to more near field speakers. And here's the video that explains near field and far field. When people listen to the playback of a recording on speakers, they can do it with either near-field or far-field monitors. Far-field monitors are typically mounted along the perimeter of the room and are usually at least 10 feet from the listener's position. When speakers are placed closer to the listener, say 2 to 4 feet, the monitors become near-field. The room is the dominant factor in hearing frequencies below 300 Hz. This is because the dimensions of the room may prevent the development of some low-frequency sounds. But the room is even more of a factor in a far-field situation. Since the speakers are generally louder, a larger portion of the sound arriving at the listener's position is reflected sound that can have standing wave patterns. Standing waves can enhance or minimize certain frequencies. With near-field speakers, the amount of direct sound is much greater than the reflected sound since the speakers are much closer and generally not as loud, so the standing waves are less of an issue. Diffusers and other acoustical treatments are used in far-field rooms to correct for any standing wave patterns. When this is done, rooms with either near-field or far-field speakers can produce accurate monitoring environments, so that what's being heard on the speakers is actually what's in the recording. So those are the near field speakers, and those are the location of the far field speakers. They're actually in the soffit, behind the soffit grill cloth. Currently, probably 90% of the people use near field versus far field speakers. And that's it for this video.